She had never planned to marry a stranger. He had never planned to feel anything again. But on the coldest night Montana had seen in 30 years, a stagecoach door swung open, and two broken lives collided in the dark. By morning, they would share a last name. By winter's end, they would share something neither of them had words for. And before the snow melted, someone powerful would arrive to take everything they had, quietly, painfully built, with forged papers, hired guns, and a courthouse full of men who had already been paid to look the other way. This is not a love story. This is a survival story. And love was just the most dangerous part of it. If this story already has you, drop your city in the comments below. Let me see how far these mountains have traveled. Hit that like button, stay until the very end, and let's begin. The stagecoach was 4 hours late. Gideon Ashcroft had been standing in the cold since 4:30, his breath clouding in the dark air, his boots slowly going numb against the frozen ground. The settlement of Harlan's Crossing didn't have much to offer a man waiting in November. A general store with a crooked sign, a post office that smelled like mildew, and a tavern that closed early on account of the owner's bad knee. The lanterns along the single main street did little more than throw orange shadows across the mud and the ice. He had told himself he wouldn't come early. He had told himself he'd ride in at the last minute, shake a hand, say a few words, and get back before the temperature dropped any further. But here he was, early, cold, and already regretting the whole arrangement. The letter from the agency had arrived 6 weeks ago, written in the careful hand of a woman named Mrs. Dorothea Plum, who ran what she called a placement service for frontier correspondence. The stationery had small printed flowers along the border. Gideon had found that detail vaguely offensive. "We have identified a suitable candidate," the letter read, "a woman of good character, practical skills, and sound constitution. She is available for placement by the first week of November, should you wish to proceed." He had stared at the phrase sound constitution for a long time, like he was ordering livestock. But he had signed the agreement and sent it back. He needed someone who could manage the cabin while he worked the land, someone who could preserve food for winter, mend what broke, keep a fire going. The ranch was functional, but barely. One man holding 300 acres together by habit and stubbornness. He wasn't looking for a companion. He wasn't looking for anything soft. He had learned in the hardest way a man can learn that soft things don't survive Montana winters. His first wife, Clara, had taught him that. Or rather, her absence had. He pushed the thought away the way he always did, quick, forceful, like shutting a door on a cold room. He was good at that. The sound of wheels and hooves finally broke through the dark. The stagecoach came around the bend too fast, the driver overworking the brake on the icy grade, and it shuddered to a stop in front of the general store with a groan of wood and leather. Gideon straightened. He pulled his hat down against the wind. The door swung open. A man climbed out first, a drummer of some kind, plump and red-faced, clutching a sample case to his chest. Then an older woman in a black traveling coat, helped down by the driver. Then a young boy who immediately ran to the older woman and grabbed her hand. Then the coach was empty. Gideon waited. Nothing. He walked to the driver, who was already unhooking the luggage from the roof rack. "You carrying a woman named Harrow? Evelyn Harrow?" The driver didn't look up. "Had a woman with that name. She's still inside." Gideon turned back to the coach. He leaned down and looked through the open door. A woman sat in the far corner of the coach, completely still, not asleep, not frightened, just still, like she was deciding something. She had a small leather bag in her lap, held with both hands, and she was looking at the floor of the coach with an expression he couldn't read. "Miss Harrow?" She looked up. Her eyes were dark brown, and they were steady in a way he hadn't expected. Not soft, not nervous. Steady. "Mr. Ashcroft," she said. Not a question. "Yeah." She stood, ducked through the low door frame, and stepped down onto the frozen ground without waiting for help. She was taller than he'd imagined from the agency's description. She wore a dark wool coat that had seen better days, and her boots were practical, heavy-soled, laced to the ankle. She had a small trunk, he noticed, just one. She looked at him directly, not boldly, not timidly, just clearly. "I apologize for the delay," she said. "The road through the pass was bad." "I know," he said. "I live past it." A pause. "Right," she said. He picked up her trunk. She didn't protest, but she kept her bag herself. They walked to his wagon in silence, and he thought, "This is the strangest thing I have ever done." Which was saying something because he'd once dug a calf out of a snowdrift at 3 in the morning with nothing but a lantern and a rope, and that had been plenty strange. He helped her up onto the wagon seat, not out of any particular gallantry, just because the step was high and the ice was bad. She took his hand for exactly 1 second and then released it. He climbed up beside her, clicked the reins, and turned the horses north. Chapam. The road to the ranch took an hour and 20 minutes in good conditions. That night, with the ice and the dark, it took closer to 2. They rode most of it without speaking. He wasn't sure what he'd expected. The agency letters had described her as educated, composed, previously married. He hadn't asked follow-up questions. It hadn't seemed relevant. About 40 minutes out, she spoke. "How far to the property line?" "Another mile past that ridge," he said, nodding ahead. "Then maybe 10 minutes to the cabin." "How many acres?" 312. 200 of its grazing land, rest is timber and rough ground. Cattle? 32 head, down from 48, hard summer. She nodded. He glanced at her. She was watching the road, not him. "You said you had a garden in your letter," she said. "Had one. What happened to it?" He paused. "Frost came early, lost most of it." "When you say most, everything except the turnips and some wild garlic that came up on its own." He paused again. The turnips weren't worth keeping. She was quiet for a moment. "I can work with that," she said, though he had no idea what she meant by it. The cabin appeared out of the dark, low and solid, its stone chimney exhaling a thin thread of smoke. Gideon had kept a banked fire before he'd left that afternoon, one of the few preparations he'd actually thought to make. He brought the horses to the barn first and settled them before anything else. Evelyn stood in the yard and waited. She didn't complain about the cold. She didn't ask how much longer. She stood with her bag and watched him work, and when he finished, she followed him inside. The cabin was, in his estimation, adequate. He knew it was rough. One main room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen corner with a cast-iron stove, a table, 2 chairs, a shelf of supplies. A narrow hallway led to 2 rooms, his, and a second room that had been used for storage. He had spent 2 days before her arrival moving the storage out of that second room. He'd hauled boxes to the barn, swept the floor, found a spare lamp, and dragged in a cot that had belonged to his late ranch hand, Emmett, who'd moved to Billings 2 years ago. He'd set a wool blanket on the cot. He had considered finding a second blanket and then decided that was sufficient. Evelyn stood in the doorway of the second room and looked at it without expression. "It's not much," he said, which he hadn't meant to say aloud. "It's fine," she said. And she meant it, he thought, or at least she wasn't saying it to be polite. She set her bag on the cot and turned. "Is there coffee?" "In the tin on the shelf." She was already moving toward the kitchen corner. He watched her locate the tin, find the pot, find the water pail, assess its level, and begin making coffee, all in about 90 seconds, with the efficiency of someone who had been making do in insufficient kitchens for a long time. He sat down at the table. He wasn't sure what else to do. She brought 2 cups and set one in front of him without asking. She sat across from him with hers and wrapped both hands around it. The fire cracked. The wind moved against the shutters. "We should talk about how this works," she said. "All right." "The agency's arrangement is for 1 year initially," she said. "After that, either party can dissolve the arrangement with 30 days' notice, or both parties can choose to formalize the marriage legally. I understand there was already a ceremony of record filed. Justice of the Peace in Harlan's Crossing. 3 weeks ago, signed it by mail." He paused. "They required it before the placement." "I know." She looked at her coffee. "That's a strange thing, to be married to someone you've never met." "Yeah," he agreed. "I'm not going to pretend otherwise." "I wasn't expecting you to." She looked up at him then, and something in her expression shifted. Not softened exactly, but adjusted, like she'd been prepared for a different kind of man and was quietly recalibrating. "I can cook, preserve food, manage a household," she said. "I have some knowledge of medicinal plants. My mother was particular about that. I can read and write well, do figures. I can't do heavy labor, but I can do sustained labor. I don't quit easily." "I noticed," he said. A flicker of something crossed her face. Not quite a smile. "What do you need most?" she asked. He thought about it honestly. "Someone to hold the inside of this place together, so I can spend the winter keeping the herd alive. The cold's going to be bad this year. I can feel it." "What does that mean practically?" "Means I'll be out more than I'm in. You'd be managing the food stores, keeping the fire, probably dealing with things that break while I'm not here." She nodded slowly. "And things will break. Things always break." "All right." She stood and took her cup back to the kitchen. She rinsed it with a small amount of water, dried it with a cloth, and set it back on the shelf with the kind of deliberate care that suggested she'd learned not to waste anything. She turned in the doorway of her room. "I won't bother you," she said, "and I'd ask you not to bother me unnecessarily. If we can manage that, I think we'll get on fine." "Fair enough," he said. She nodded once and closed the door. He sat alone at the table with his coffee and the fire and the sound of the wind picking up outside. He was thinking, and he couldn't have said exactly why, that the agency letter had been wrong. Not wrong about her being educated or capable, but sound constitution hadn't come close to capturing whatever it was she carried, whatever it was that made her walk into a stranger's dark cabin at 10 at night in the middle of a Montana winter and make coffee without a tremor in her hands. He didn't know what to call it. He blew out the lamp and went to bed. The first week established a pattern. Gideon rose at 4:30. He was quiet about it, old habit from years of not waking Clara, who slept lightly and needed the rest. He made his own coffee and was out the door before 5. He came back mid-morning for a short time to warm up, then went out again until dark. When he returned in the evenings, there was food. Not elaborate food, she wasn't working with much, but food that was hot and had been thought about. The first night, it was salt pork with roasted root vegetables she'd found in the back of his supply shelf. The second night, it was a thick soup from the same salt pork plus dried beans and the wild garlic. The third night, somehow, she had made a kind of flatbread from the flour and rendered lard, and it was better than it had any right to be. He ate without comment. She ate across from him. They talked about practical things. The firewood supply, which needed to be restacked before the next storm. The state of the water barrel near the barn, which was developing a slow leak. The inventory of the root cellar, which she had apparently organized in its entirety on the second day while he was out with the cattle. "You didn't have to do that," he said, when she mentioned it. "It needed doing," she said. "You had turnips you didn't know about." "I told you those turnips weren't—" "They're fine," she said, with a certainty that brooked no argument. "I pickled them." He blinked. "You pickled turnips?" "You had enough salt and vinegar. It's not complicated." He didn't say anything else about the turnips. She was, he noticed, very careful with the supplies. She measured things. She planned meals 3 or 4 days ahead. When he came in from a hard day and was hungry enough to eat whatever was nearest, she would redirect him toward the cold leftovers from dinner rather than the flour or the dried goods. Not with words, just by handing him the right thing before he could reach for something else. She did it so smoothly that he was 3 days in before he realized she was managing him. He wasn't sure how he felt about that. He also wasn't sure she'd noticed him noticing. Tooltip. She was writing something. He'd seen it from the first night, the way she sat at the table by the lamp after dinner, her back straight, a small wooden box of paper and ink at her side that she brought out of her room with the same care another woman might have given to a Bible or a jewelry case. He didn't ask. She didn't explain. But one evening, coming in later than usual, the northernmost fence line had taken 3 hours to repair in the dark, and he'd pushed too long trying to finish it. He found her still at the table, writing, when he expected the lamp to be out. She was so absorbed that she didn't hear him come in, and he stood in the doorway for a moment before the cold following him through the door made her look up. She closed the letter quickly, not with guilt, exactly, just with the reflex of someone who was used to having their private things looked at without permission. "There's soup on the stove," she said. "I saw it. Thank you." He pulled off his coat and hung it. "You don't have to wait up." "I wasn't waiting," she said. I was writing." He nodded toward the box, which she'd closed but not put away. "Letters?" "Yes." "Family?" A small pause. "Not exactly." He didn't push it. He got his soup and ate it standing at the stove because his hands were still too cold to sit still. After a few minutes, she opened the box again and continued writing, and he realized she'd trusted him in some small way to let her be. He sat down with his bowl and read the old almanac he kept by the fireplace, and didn't look at her, and the fire went on burning, and the wind went on making its noise at the shutters, and it was not comfortable exactly, but something adjacent to it, a kind of truce with silence. 10 days after her arrival, the first real blizzard hit. Gideon had felt it coming for 48 hours. A pressure change in the air, a particular quality of stillness before the storm, the cattle growing restless and bunching together without being driven. He spent the day before the storm hauling extra firewood to the porch, checking every latch and hinge on the barn, bringing two of the more vulnerable cattle into the barn's interior, and laying in a supply of water from the well before it froze solid. He told Evelyn that evening, "Tomorrow we don't go outside unless we have to." She looked up from the stove where she was reducing some kind of liquid in the small pot. He couldn't tell what. "How bad?" "Could be 2 or 3 days." She nodded, turned back to the stove. "I'll finish the salt preserves tonight." He stared at her. "It's almost 9 o'clock." "I know." She stirred the pot. "It won't take long." He went to bed. She was still working when he fell asleep, and when he got up at 4:30, the storm had arrived. A solid white wall beyond the windows, the wind screaming at the corners of the cabin. And she had left 2 jars of finished preserves on the shelf, and the kitchen was clean. He checked the barn twice in the first hour, despite the near-zero visibility, finding his way by rope he'd tied from the porch rail to the barn door the previous afternoon. The cattle were miserable but stable. He got back inside and discovered that Evelyn had kept the fire built up and had figured out, on her own, that the second fireplace in what had been used as a storage corner needed to be opened and lit, because the main room was too large to heat from one source alone in this kind of cold. The second fireplace hadn't been used in 4 years. "There was some blockage in the flue," she said, when he came in and found it burning. "I cleared it with a stick." "You could have waited for me." "It was getting cold." She said it simply, not defensively. "It was getting cold, so I fixed it," like it was obvious. He stood there in his wet coat and his snow-covered hat and felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. The specific disorientation of having been taken care of by someone, in a small way, without being asked. He didn't know what to do with that. "Thank you," he said finally. She was already turning back to the kitchen. "There's coffee." Buck. They were trapped inside for 3 days. He had expected it to be a kind of suffocation. 2 strangers, this small space, no way out. He had braced himself for the friction of it, for the irritations that accumulate when people can't get away from each other. It wasn't like that. It was still uncomfortable, but in stranger, more unexpected ways. Like the way he kept starting to say something and then stopping himself because he'd gotten so used to the silence that he'd forgotten whether or not you were supposed to fill it. Like the way she sometimes looked up from whatever she was doing and opened her mouth and then closed it again, and he never knew what she'd almost said. They played cards on the second day. It was her suggestion, and it surprised him. She played with a quiet competitiveness that also surprised him. She didn't let him win, and she didn't apologize when she didn't. "You've done this before," he said, after she'd taken her 4th hand in a row. "My father and I used to play. He was very good." A pause. He said the best way to know someone's character was to play cards with them. "And? What's mine?" She considered the cards in her hand without looking up. "You take risks you don't have to, but you don't lose your temper when they fail." She paused. "It's not the worst combination." He wasn't sure whether she'd just complimented him or diagnosed him. On the 3rd day, the wind finally dropped off enough to hear their own voices without effort, and he found himself talking more than he'd talked to anyone in. He couldn't remember. He told her about the ranch, about his father, who had built the first walls of the cabin himself and then died before the roof was finished. About the early years when he'd had a hired man named Emmett who knew cattle better than anyone he'd ever met, and who had also had absolutely no idea how to read, and who had eventually learned by having Gideon read to him every evening after dinner. "What did you read?" she asked. "Whatever I had. Almanacs mostly. Some newspapers when I could get them." Emmett liked the legal notices. She laughed at that. It was the first time he'd heard her laugh. Not a big laugh, just a short, real sound, surprised out of her, and it changed the whole quality of the room. "Why the legal notices?" she asked. He said they were the most interesting part. He said all the real stories were in what the law was trying to prevent. She was quiet for a moment, still smiling slightly. Then something shifted in her expression. The smile stayed, but something behind it went elsewhere. "He wasn't wrong," she said. Her voice had a different quality now. Not sad exactly, but weighted. He let it sit. After a while, she picked up the cards and shuffled them and dealt another hand, and they played until the lamp oil ran low, and they had to call it by mutual unspoken agreement and go to their separate rooms. The shoulder had been bothering him since October. He'd taken a bad fall off the barn roof in early September, a patch of rot he hadn't seen until it gave way under him. And something in his left shoulder had never recovered properly. It wasn't broken. He'd been fairly sure about that at the time, and the way it had healed more or less confirmed it. But the joint ached in a specific grinding way when he overworked it, and 3 days in a row of fighting ice and wind and cattle had overworked it considerably. He didn't mention it. He was good at not mentioning things. But Evelyn noticed the way he was carrying himself on the 4th day after the storm broke. The angle of his left arm, the way he turned his whole body rather than his shoulder when he needed to look sideways. He was unloading supplies from the storage shelf, and he heard her step closer, and then she said, "Stop." He stopped. "Left shoulder?" "It's nothing." "Let me look." "I said it's—" "I heard what you said." She stepped around in front of him and looked at his face instead of his shoulder, the way a person does when they're assessing whether you're going to be reasonable about something. He must have been readable, because she made a small sound of impatience and said, "Sit down." He sat down. He wasn't entirely sure why. She went to her room and came back with a cloth bag he hadn't noticed before among her things. She set it on the table and opened it with the brisk, purposeful movement of someone who had done this before. Inside were small tied bundles, dried plants from the smell of them, and a glass bottle of something amber-colored in strips of cloth. "What is that?" he asked. Arnica and comfrey mostly, and some calendula." She was already measuring something into her palm. "My mother grew them. I dried these before I left." "Left where?" She hesitated, just briefly. "Missouri," she said. He watched her mix the dried material with something from the amber bottle, working it between her palms. "What's in the bottle?" "Witch hazel." She looked up. "It's not going to burn. Take your shirt off." He raised an eyebrow. "Your shoulder," she said flatly, "cannot be treated through flannel." He took off his shirt. It was cold enough in the cabin that he felt the air immediately, and also, he was aware, in a way he hadn't been before, aware of someone else in the room. Not in a simple way, just aware. He'd lived alone for 4 years. That fact seemed suddenly louder than it had before. She didn't react to any of that. She assessed the shoulder with the same focused practicality she applied to everything else, pressing 2 fingers against specific points, asking him where it hurt most, where the grinding sensation was, whether it was worse after heat or cold. "After cold," he said. "That's the joint." She began applying the mixture with her hands, and her hands were warm, warmer than he'd have expected, and firm enough to be useful without being rough. "You've been compensating, probably since October." "September," he said. She made a sound, not quite exasperated. "Why didn't you say something?" "Nothing to say. Except that it hurt. Hurts less than it did." She was quiet for a moment, working. Her fingers found a particular knot of muscle near the blade, and he couldn't quite keep his expression neutral, and she eased off just slightly and said, "That's where it's stuck." "Yeah. This will help, but you'll need to not throw hay bales with it for at least—" "I'll throw what I need to throw." She stopped. He could feel her not saying something. Then she resumed, and her voice when it came was even and measured. "I'm not telling you not to work. I'm telling you that if you keep using that joint the way it is, you're going to damage it in a way that won't heal well. And then you'll be throwing hay bales one-armed, which will be considerably slower and more dangerous." He thought about that. 3 weeks, she said. "Keep it easier for 3 weeks, and I'll work on it every other day. By then it should be functional." Define functional. Functional meaning you can stop carrying yourself like a man who lost an arm and is trying to hide it. He almost laughed. He caught himself. "Fine," he said. She finished applying the mixture and wrapped the joint with a strip of cloth, not tightly, just enough to hold warmth, and told him to leave it for 2 hours. He pulled his shirt back on, and she was already putting her things away, tying the bundles closed with small pieces of string, tucking the amber bottle back in the bag. "Thank you," he said. "It's practical," she said. Not dismissive, just honest, like she couldn't accept gratitude that she hadn't earned. He sat by the fire with his shoulder held still and warm and watched her go back to her letter writing and thought that he had been very, very wrong about what kind of woman was going to step off that stagecoach. The first time they had an argument, it was about the roof. Snow had built up on the east section of the cabin roof more than he'd anticipated, and he could hear on the 12th night a particular settling sound from the beams that he didn't like. He had climbed up in the morning to clear it, which was not a complicated task, just a cold and slightly precarious one. He'd done it 3 times in previous winters. He came in at midday to warm up and found Evelyn standing in the middle of the main room looking at the ceiling with her arms crossed. "The beam over the east corner is flexing," she said. "I know. I cleared the snow." "Did you check the joint where it meets the wall?" He paused. "I cleared the snow." She turned and looked at him with an expression that was not quite accusing but was definitely pointed. "The weight that's been on it for the past 10 days didn't just go away because the snow's gone. The stress stays in the wood." She glanced up again. "You need to check the joint." "I've been doing this for 15 years. "I'm not saying you haven't." "Then what are you saying?" She faced him directly. "I'm saying that the joint over that corner looks different than it did 3 weeks ago, and that I've been watching the ceiling all morning because of the sound it made last night, and that I'm asking you to check it before something else builds up on it." He held her gaze for a moment. "How do you know what a load-bearing joint looks like?" "My uncle built houses in St. Louis for 20 years, she said. "I spent a lot of time on job sites as a child." He hadn't known that. Of course he hadn't. They'd been sharing a roof for 2 weeks, and there were entire countries of her life he knew nothing about. He checked the joint. She was right. There was a hairline crack at the mortise that hadn't been there last fall. He repaired it. It took 3 hours, freezing cold, up in the rafters with a chisel and pine tar. And when he came down, he found dinner ready, and Evelyn at the table with her letters, and he sat down and ate without saying anything about it. After a while, she looked up. "Was it bad?" "Manageable," he said. "You were right." She looked back down at her letter. He had the sense she was filing that away. Not for future use against him, just filing it, noting it, the way you note the character of a thing. "Thank you for checking," she said. "Thank you for seeing it," he said. It was the first time he thought that they had come anywhere near equal ground. The cold got worse in late November. Not the blizzard kind of cold. The dry, still, absolute kind, where the sky was perfectly clear and the temperature dropped so far below zero that you could hear the trees crack at 3 in the morning. The kind of cold that didn't look like danger until it had already hurt you. The cattle suffered. Gideon was out before 4 every morning and sometimes not back until long after dark. His face burned red by the air, his fingers thick and slow. He came in one night and couldn't undo his own coat buttons and stood in the doorway struggling with them until Evelyn appeared from the kitchen, looked at his hands, and undid them herself without a word. She brought him to the fire, made him hold his hands low over it, not too close, and told him to wait. He waited. She brought the lamp closer to look at his fingers. "These 2 are concerning," she said, tapping his ring and middle finger on the left hand. "Do they hurt?" "They're numb." "That's what I said." She made him keep his hands near the warmth and not rub them and not put them directly against anything hot, and the feeling came back slowly and painfully, and when it was fully back, she brought him hot broth and stood by until he'd drunk it. "The cattle worth it?" she asked. "I got 3 back inside the barn. There's an old heifer I'm worried about." "Will you lose her?" "Maybe." He stared into the cup. "Lost 3 to cold last winter. You'd think I'd be better at it by now." "Better at what?" He wasn't sure exactly. "Cutting your losses," he said. "Knowing when to stop." She sat down across from him. She looked at him with that level, clear gaze that he'd come to understand was not coldness, but rather the opposite, a kind of fierce attentiveness that just happened to look like detachment from the outside. "You don't have to be good at that," she said. "At some point you do. Frontier winters don't." "I'm not talking about the cattle," she said quietly. He looked at her. She held his gaze for just a moment and then looked away, as if she'd said more than she'd meant to. She stood and took her cup to the kitchen. He sat with what she'd said for a long time. He wasn't sure he understood it fully. He wasn't sure she'd meant for him to. But he understood enough. Clara had died in February, 4 years ago. He never talked about it. People in Harlan's Crossing knew, at a certain distance, the way small settlements know things. But no one brought it up to his face, because he had made it clear in the first months after that he would not discuss it. He had a look he'd practiced for when people came too close to the subject. It worked. People stopped coming close. He'd been 3 days out, riding the far range, when the fever came for her. By the time he'd gotten the message, a boy on horseback, finding him in a valley with no shelter and no way to move fast through the drifts, she'd been sick for 36 hours. He had pushed the horse as hard as he dared. He had pushed himself harder. He had arrived home 6 hours too late. He had lived in the years since with a specific and grinding conviction that if he had been faster or smarter or less stubborn about finishing what he started, she would have survived. He carried it the way you carry a stone. You get used to the weight, but you never forget it's there. He hadn't told Evelyn any of this. He hadn't planned to. It happened on a Tuesday in early December, in the middle of an argument about something completely unrelated, the woodpile specifically, and whether the stack on the north side of the barn was adequate given the forecast. He had said it was fine. She had disagreed. The disagreement had escalated the way small disagreements do when they're really about something else, and somewhere in the middle of it, when she said too precisely, "You keep assuming you can predict what's going to happen and then being surprised when you're wrong," something in him cracked open. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. He just stopped arguing and said flatly, "My first wife died because I wasn't here." Evelyn went still. "I was 3 days out on the range. She got sick. By the time I got the message and came back, she was gone." He heard himself saying it like he was reading from a document, distant, factual, stripped. 6 hours. If I'd left when I should have, or gone faster, or not taken the long fence route the day before. He stopped. He looked at the woodpile. "I ran my calculations every which way for 4 years, and I never came up with a version where she lives. But I can't stop running them." Silence. Evelyn didn't say, "I'm sorry." She didn't say, "It wasn't your fault." He was grateful for that, because he'd heard both of those things from other people, and they had felt like being handed something in the wrong size, thus well-intentioned, useless. What she said was, what was her name? Clara. What was she like? He'd been asked that once before, and he'd shut it down. But Evelyn was asking it differently. Not morbidly curious, not performing sympathy. She was asking it the way you ask about something that mattered, like she deserved a real answer. She laughed at everything, he said, even things that weren't funny. She had this absolute refusal to let anything be too dark. He paused. The winter before she died, we had the worst November I can remember. 3 cattle dead, the south fence gone. I'd cracked 2 ribs from a fall. And she made up a song about turnips. He stopped. He had not thought about the turnip song in 4 years. Evelyn looked at him and her eyes were wet, not dramatically, just at the edges. She didn't hide it, and she didn't apologize for it. "She sounds like she was extraordinary," she said. "Yeah," he said. "She was." A long quiet. "I'm not asking you to stop missing her," Evelyn said. Her voice was careful. I wouldn't ask you that, but I think you should know that the fact that you came back as fast as you did, and that it still wasn't fast enough, that's not a calculation. That's just what happened." She paused. "I don't think you failed her." He looked at her. She held his gaze and she meant it. He could see that she meant it in a specific, undecorated way, not as comfort, but as a statement of fact she was prepared to stand behind. He didn't know what to say. "Come on," she said, after a moment, turning back to the woodpile. "I'll help you with the north stack. If it is fine, I'll admit it. And if it's not, then we fix it," she said. He watched her pull on her gloves and pick up a log, and thought that he had been living for 4 years in a cabin that had been, in every way that mattered, empty. He thought it was possible, just possible, that it wasn't empty anymore. They fell into something that wasn't quite friendship and wasn't quite partnership and didn't have a name yet. They had their routines now. The early morning, the separate work, the shared evenings. She kept her letters private, but she didn't hide the writing anymore. He'd stopped bracing himself when he came in the door, the way you brace yourself against something unpleasant. One evening, she looked up from her writing and said without preamble, "Before I came here, I worked for a firm in Jefferson City." He looked up from the almanac. "Not as a secretary," she said, in a tone that suggested she was anticipating an assumption. "As a researcher, legal research. The firm did land and property cases, a lot of railroad work." She paused. "My husband was a member of the firm." "Was," he repeated. "He's still alive," she said. "We separated 2 years ago." She looked back at her letter. "He didn't understand why I kept working. He found it." She chose the word carefully. Embarrassing. Gideon said nothing. "I was good at it," she said. Not with pride, exactly, just with the plain conviction of someone stating a fact they'd had to fight for. Good enough that some of the senior partners consulted me directly, not officially, unofficially. She turned the pen in her fingers. He thought I was making him look inadequate. "Were you?" She looked up, and the ghost of a real smile crossed her face. "Probably a little," she said. He almost laughed. She set the pen down. "I'm telling you this because I think you should know who you're actually sharing a house with, not the agency's description of me, the actual person." "I think I've been getting to know the actual person," he said. She considered that. "Maybe," she said, "but I wanted to say it plainly." She picked up the pen again. "I'm not just practical skills and sound constitution. I have a history." "So do I," he said. "I know." She said it simply and returned to her letter. He returned to the almanac, and the fire went on, and the wind went on, and outside the Montana winter did its cold, indifferent work. But inside the cabin, something small and sturdy had taken root, the way plants do in unexpected places. Not dramatic, not loud, just real. Chip. The month of December moved through its cold paces. He fixed the joint in the east beam properly. It took 2 days and materials he had to improvise from what was in the barn, but when he was done, it was solid. She made vinegared vegetables from the turnips that turned out to be genuinely, surprisingly good. The old heifer he'd worried about survived. They lost one younger steer to the cold in the 3rd week, and he came in that night with a set jaw, and she didn't ask him about it, just made sure there was something hot on the stove, and left him alone to sit by the fire until he was ready to be around another person. He was ready within an hour. That was new. On Christmas Eve, not because of any particular ceremony, just because it was the longest night of the year and the wind had dropped for the first time in weeks, she brought out a bottle she'd had in her bag since arrival. "Some kind of brandy," she said, "from Missouri." "I've been saving it," she said. "For what?" She poured 2 cups, small ones. "For a night that felt like it might last." He took his cup and looked at it. Outside, the quiet that had replaced the wind was the most complete silence he'd heard in weeks. The fire was good. The lamps were low. The cabin was, for the first time, warm throughout. Both fireplaces burning, the heat filling the space properly in a way it hadn't in years, because it hadn't had anyone in the east rooms to justify it. He raised the cup. She raised hers. "To sound constitutions," he said. She blinked, and then she laughed. A real laugh this time. Not the brief, surprised one from before. A full, genuine, slightly undignified laugh that surprised her as much as it surprised him. "To sound constitutions," she said. They drank. Outside, the mountains stood white and vast and indifferent, as they always had. Inside, 2 strangers, who were slowly becoming something more complicated than strangers, sat across a table from each other in the light of a fire one of them had built, and the other had tended and let the silence be comfortable. It was the best Christmas he'd had in a long time. He wasn't sure if he should say that. He decided not to. Some things could wait. January arrived without ceremony. The brandy bottle was empty, the Christmas quiet had burned off like morning frost, and the ranch came back to its full demands with the indifference of a foreman who'd allowed one afternoon off and now expected double the work in return. Gideon was up at 4 again, out before 5, and the cold that greeted him each morning had a quality to it that went beyond temperature, a kind of pressure, like the air itself was pushing back against anyone foolish enough to be alive in it. He didn't complain about it. He'd never complained about Montana winters, not once in the 15 years he'd worked this land. But Evelyn noticed, the way she noticed things, quietly, from a slight distance, filing it away. She noticed that he came in some evenings moving slower than the work alone accounted for. She noticed that he ate faster when he was worn out, like his body was trying to refuel before he could think too much about stopping. She noticed that on the worst nights he sat by the fire with the almanac open in his lap and didn't read a single word. She didn't say anything about it. She just made sure the coffee was strong and the fire was built up and the food was ready at a reasonable hour instead of whenever she happened to finish it. It was the kind of care that didn't announce itself. He appreciated that more than he could have said. What he didn't know was that she was having her own hard January. The letters she'd been writing since her arrival were replies to a single correspondent, a woman named Ruth, her older sister, who lived in Kansas City and who wrote back with the faithful regularity of someone genuinely worried. Evelyn hadn't told Gideon about Ruth, not because she was hiding it, but because it hadn't come up in the natural course of things, and she'd learned in her previous life that volunteering personal information in a shared space often meant watching it get used against you later. But Ruth's most recent letter, which had arrived with the post writer in the second week of January, had not been easy reading. She read it 3 times over 2 days, sitting at the table after Gideon had gone to his room, and each time she read it, she felt the same specific tightening in her chest. Not panic, not grief exactly, something more like the feeling of a door you thought was closed beginning to open again on its own. Her former husband, the letter said, had been asking questions about her whereabouts. He had inquired at the agency. He had written to 2 people they'd known in Jefferson City who might know where she'd gone. He hadn't made any formal legal action, Ruth said, carefully worded, but he had been asking. Evelyn set the letter down and looked at the ceiling for a while. She was not afraid of him. That was important to be clear about, even just to herself. She was not afraid. What she felt was something colder and more practical than fear. She felt the specific exhaustion of a woman who had carefully dismantled one life and built the skeleton of another one and did not want to spend energy looking over her shoulder while she was still learning to stand up straight in the new one. She put Ruth's letter in the wooden box with the others and closed the lid and went to bed. She did not sleep particularly well. In the morning, she made breakfast and Gideon came in from the barn and they ate together, and he told her the old heifer was showing signs of a respiratory problem. She told him she had some dried thyme that might help, used as a steam treatment if he could get the animal to stand still for it. He looked skeptical. She told him to try it anyway. He said he would think about it. She said that meant no and handed him the thyme anyway. He took it. She watched him go back out across the yard and thought, "This is the life I chose. This exact life. The cold and the impracticality, and the man with the bad shoulder and the cattle with their problems. This is what I picked when I signed that paper." She wasn't unhappy about it. That was the thing that surprised her most. She had expected to feel the arrangement like a weight, something she was enduring in exchange for safety and stability. Instead, she felt it like a shape, like the edges of something that fit. She didn't examine that feeling too closely. She had learned that examining feelings too closely was how you talked yourself out of things that were actually working. The time worked on the heifer. He didn't say so directly, but he came in 3 days later and said offhandedly that the old girl was doing better, and that was the same thing. The 3rd week of January brought a cold snap that made everything before it seem mild by comparison. The temperature dropped so far below 0 that Gideon stopped using numbers and just said, when she asked, "Bad." She stopped asking and started paying attention to other indicators. How long it took for the water in the kitchen pail to develop a skim of ice after she moved it away from the stove. How much wood they were burning per day. How long the gaps between his trips outside could reasonably be pushed before something suffered for it. She began keeping a rough log. Not formally, just notes in the margin of an old catalog she found on the supply shelf. Temperature indicators. Wood consumption. Food inventory. She tracked the root cellar stores in her head and adjusted the meals accordingly, quietly removing things from the rotation that were running low and substituting things that weren't. He noticed the catalog one evening, picked it up without asking, and looked at her notes for a long moment. "You've been doing this the whole time?" he asked. "Since the first blizzard," she said. He set it down. He was quiet for a moment. "We're lower on flour than I thought." "I know. I've been compensating since the 2nd week of December." "With what?" "Cornmeal and the dried beans. And the turnips." She paused. "The turnips have been useful. He looked at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize. Not quite gratitude, something more complicated than gratitude. Like he was recalibrating something, adjusting a calculation. "I could have told you about the flower situation," he said. "I found it," she said. "It didn't require discussion." "Still." He turned his cup in his hands. "You don't have to handle everything alone." She met his eyes. "Neither do you," she said. It was the same thing she'd said differently on that night with the woodpile. He heard it the same way he had then, not as a rebuke, but as an offer. Something extended without drama, without conditions. "We need to make a supply run when the weather breaks," he said eventually. "I know, I've made a list." He almost smiled. "Of course you have." She did smile briefly. "It's a good list." The weather broke for 4 days at the end of January. Not warm, not even close to warm, but calm enough to travel. And they rode into Harlan's Crossing together for the first time. She had not been back to the settlement since the night she'd arrived. Riding in beside him on the wagon seat, in the thin winter daylight, she saw it differently than she had in the dark. Smaller in some ways, the buildings more modest, the single street shorter. But there was life in it. Smoke from chimneys, a woman in a heavy coat crossing from the general store to the post office with a child wrapped against her hip. 2 men working on a piece of farm equipment in the open air, their breath clouding. She had not realized how much she'd missed the sight of other people. The general store was run by a man named Abel Pierce, wide, gray-haired, with the careful eyes of someone who processed a great deal of information about everyone who came through his door and filed all of it for later. He greeted Gideon with the comfortable familiarity of a long acquaintance and looked at Evelyn with unabashed curiosity. "So this is her," he said to Gideon, not unkindly. "This is Evelyn," Gideon said, which was neither confirmation nor introduction, but something in between. She offered her hand. "Evelyn Ashcroft," she said, which was the first time she had used that name aloud to anyone other than the justice of the peace, and it felt strange in her mouth. Not wrong, just new. Abel shook her hand. His grip was good. "Pierce," he said. "You settling in all right up there?" "Yes," she said, though your neighbor's flower supply was in worse shape than anyone admitted. Abel laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of him. He glanced at Gideon with something like approval. "She figured that out, did she?" "Within 2 weeks," Gideon said with a tone she'd never heard from him before. Not quite pride, something adjacent to it. She turned away to look at the shelves before either of them could see her face. They loaded the wagon in the cold air, working alongside each other with the efficiency they'd developed without deciding to. He lifted the heavy things, she organized them in the wagon bed to balance the weight. Neither of them gave direction because neither of them needed to. Abel stood in his doorway and watched them work and said nothing, but his expression said plenty. Riding back up the mountain road with the wagon full and the horses working harder on the grade, Evelyn felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight since Ruth's letter. Not because anything had changed, just because the day had been ordinary. Just because they had bought flour and salt and done a normal thing together, and it had been fine. It had been more than fine. "You all right?" Gideon asked. He was watching the road, not her. "Yes," she said. Then, after a pause, "I got a letter last week from my sister." He waited. "My former husband has been asking after my location." She said it evenly, without drama, watching the road the same way he was. "I don't think it will come to anything. He's not a violent man. He's just a particular kind of stubborn. Particular how? He doesn't like losing things," she said, "even things he didn't want." Gideon said nothing for a moment. The horses worked on the grade, hooves crunching in the packed snow. "If it does come to something," he said finally, "we deal with it." "I know," she said. "I wasn't asking for—" "I know you weren't asking," he said. "I'm telling you anyway." She looked at him then, his profile against the white sky. Angular, weathered, still holding something careful in the line of his jaw that she recognized because she held something similar in her own body. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. They rode the rest of the way home in the easy quiet that had become, without either of them deciding, the native language of their life together. February came in hard and then, surprisingly, broke early. There were days in the second week where the temperature climbed above freezing for a few hours in the afternoon, and the snow on the south-facing slopes began to shift. Not spring, nowhere near spring, but a loosening, a hint. The cattle lifted their heads differently on those afternoons. Even the horses seemed to stand differently, less braced. She found him one evening at the workbench in the barn, doing something with a piece of wood and a small chisel. He didn't hear her come in, or he heard her and didn't break the work, and she stood for a moment watching him. The lantern threw a warm circle over the bench. His movements were careful, concentrated. Whatever he was making was small enough to fit in both hands. She didn't ask. She had come to find a specific tool from the barn shelf, found it, and left. She did not think about it again for 3 weeks because there were other things demanding her attention. The particular other thing that demanded it arrived on a Wednesday in late February on horseback, in the form of a man named Harlow Christ. She was alone in the cabin when he appeared. Gideon was out with the cattle. She heard the horse first, then the knock, and opened the door to find a man in his late 40s in an expensive traveling coat that was wrong for the terrain. The kind of coat bought in a city by someone who had not been told what Montana winters actually required. He had cold, reddened cheeks and a practiced smile and the air of someone accustomed to being let in wherever he arrived. "Mrs. Ashcroft?" he said, which confirmed that he'd done some prior inquiry. "Yes," she said. "My name is Harlow Christ. I represent the Meridian Railroad Development Corporation." He produced a card, which she accepted without looking at it. "I wonder if I might speak with your husband." "He's not here," she said. "Ah." The smile didn't drop. "When do you expect him?" "I don't," she said pleasantly, "give that information to people I've just met." A slight adjustment in his expression. Recalibration. She recognized it. She'd seen it in every boardroom and every courthouse anteroom she'd ever worked near. A man deciding which approach to use next. "Of course," he said. "Perhaps I could wait." "No," she said, "but I'll tell him you came." She wrote his name and company on the paper he gave her, right in front of him, slow and deliberate, so he could see she was noting it properly. Then she thanked him and closed the door. She stood in the quiet cabin and looked at the card. Meridian Railroad Development Corporation. She had heard that name before, in Jefferson City, in the files that had passed through the firm where she'd worked, cases involving contested land claims, contested surveys, contested government documents. She had read hundreds of such files, and she had a good memory for names. Meridian had been in 3 of those cases. They had won all 3. She set the card on the table and put the kettle on and thought very carefully about what she remembered, and what she needed to find out, and what she was going to say to Gideon when he came in that evening, and how she was going to say it without alarming him before she understood what they were actually dealing with. He came in at dusk, cold and tired, and she had dinner ready, and the fire up, and the card sitting in the middle of the table where he'd see it immediately. He picked it up, read it, set it down. "When?" he said. "This afternoon, around 2. "What did he want?" "He said he wanted to speak with you." She brought the food to the table. "He didn't say about what, but I know the company." He looked at her. "From my work in Jefferson City," she said, "they do land acquisition, mostly through legal means." She paused. "Sometimes not." He was quiet for a moment, turning the card over in his fingers. "What kind of not?" She sat down. "Forged surveys, challenged titles. They find flaws in original land grants. Real ones when they can, manufactured ones when they can't, and they file claims based on those flaws." She held his gaze. "In 2 of the 3 cases I'm aware of, the landowners didn't know what they were dealing with until the filing was already done and the clock was running." Gideon looked at the card for a long moment. Then he looked at her. "How sure are you?" "Sure enough," she said, "that I want to see your original land grant documentation before we meet with anyone from that company." He was already pushing back from the table. The documents were in a tin box in his room. She'd never had occasion to go into his room before, and she followed him there now without thinking about it, which was itself a marker of how far they'd come from the first night. He pulled the box from the shelf above his bed and carried it to the table and opened it. The land grant was old. The paper had yellowed at the edges, and the ink had faded in places, but it was intact, and the seal was there, and the signature of the Territorial Land Office was present. She read it twice. Then she read the survey documentation attached to it. Then she sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment. The boundary description in the grant uses the old survey method, she said. Landmark-based. The ridgeline, the creek bend, the stand of old pines. She tapped the paper. Those landmarks don't change, but Meridian has argued in at least one case that landmark-based surveys are inherently imprecise and that a modern survey supersedes them. She looked at him. If they've already commissioned a competing survey, they can't have been on my land without me knowing, he said. They don't have to survey your land, she said. They survey adjacent land and adjust the boundary line in the description. Then they file the new survey as a correction to the original. She paused. The original landowner usually doesn't find out until the filing creates a legal conflict. He stared at the papers. Gideon, she said carefully, we need a lawyer. The nearest lawyer is in Miles City. I know. That's 2 days in good weather. I know that too, she said, but I also know what it costs to not move fast when these things start moving. She gathered the documents carefully and squared them into a neat stack, the way she'd once squared briefs and filings in a building 1,000 miles away that had felt like her whole world and had turned out to be only a chapter. We don't have to panic. We have to be prepared. He looked at her across the table, and she could see him processing it. Not the legal situation, which he'd absorbed quickly, but something about her, the way she'd laid it out, the steadiness of it. You've been in this kind of room before, he said. Not a question. Many times, she said, just never on this side of the table. He reached across and put his hand over the stack of documents, not taking them from her, just placing his hand there, a gesture of something. Acknowledgement, the fact of a shared problem. Tell me what you need, he said. She looked at his hand on the papers and then at his face and felt, not for the first time in these weeks, but more clearly than before, the particular complicated ache of being understood by someone when you'd stopped expecting it. Time, she said, and your trust that I know what I'm looking at. You've had that, he said. You just didn't know it. Outside, February pushed against the cabin walls, and the mountains stood in their cold indifference. And inside, without ceremony or announcement, two people who had arrived in each other's lives out of necessity looked at each other across a table of old documents and a shared problem, and chose, without saying it aloud, to meet it together. Harlow Chris came back 4 days later, and this time Gideon was home. Evelyn watched from the kitchen window as the man rode up the approach trail on the same city-wrong horse, in the same city-wrong coat, with the same practiced ease of a man who believed his presence was always welcome. She dried her hands on the cloth by the stove and went to stand in the main room. Gideon was already at the door. He didn't open it until the second knock. She noticed that. He was making a point about who set the pace here, and he was making it without saying a word. Chris stepped inside when invited, took off his hat, looked around the cabin with eyes that priced everything they landed on, and smiled at Evelyn like they were old acquaintances. Mrs. Ashcroft, he said. Good to see you again. Mr. Christ, she said. Gideon did not offer coffee. He gestured to the table and they all sat, and Chris set his hat on the edge and folded his hands and began. The Meridian Railroad Development Corporation, he explained, was engaged in a regional expansion project that would bring a rail line through the Northern Valley. This was, he assured them, a tremendous opportunity for the entire settlement. Increased commerce, easier transport, better prices for cattle at market. He said all of it with the smooth confidence of a man who had given the same speech in many different kitchens and found it effective. Gideon said nothing. His arms were crossed and his face was the face he used when he was waiting for the actual point. Chris got to it eventually. The proposed rail corridor, he said, required a right-of-way across the eastern edge of the Ashcroft property. A narrow strip, he said narrow, perhaps 40 feet wide. The company was prepared to compensate generously. He produced a paper and slid it across the table. Gideon looked at it. Evelyn looked at it. The number written on the paper was not ungenerous. She noted that. She also noted that the proposed right-of-way on the attached diagram was drawn in a way that made 40 feet look considerably smaller than it was relative to the full property, a drafting trick she'd seen before in the files in Jefferson City, where things were made to appear minor on paper that were substantial on the ground. The strip, she said, pointing to the diagram, it crosses the east pasture? The eastern edge, yes, Chris said pleasantly. Largely unused land, as I understand it. It's not unused, Gideon said. His voice was level, but she heard something underneath it. It's the winter grazing approach. I move the herd through there every November and March. A minor adjustment to your grazing pattern. It's not minor, Gideon said. And it's not an adjustment. It's the only terrain that's passable with a full herd in early spring. The rest is too steep or too wet. Chris tilted his head in a way that suggested he was listening while not particularly absorbing anything. I'm sure we could accommodate. Can I keep this? Evelyn asked, tapping the diagram. Chris looked at her. The pleasant expression held. Of course, he said. We want this to be a collaborative process. Wonderful, she said, and folded it and set it beside her. They showed Chris out 20 minutes later, after he had left behind another card, another offer to discuss terms at their mutual convenience, and a parting smile that didn't reach his eyes. Gideon closed the door and stood with his hand on the latch for a moment. Collaborative process, he said. That's what they call it, she said, before they file. She already had the diagram on the table and was studying it. He came and stood beside her, looking over her shoulder. They've already surveyed, she said. Look at the precision of this boundary line. You don't draw this without being on the ground. They were on my land, probably in October or September, before the snow. She traced the line with one finger. And look here, this corner marker. That's not your ridgeline. Your grant document describes the northeast corner as the ridgeline where the two rock outcroppings are visible. This line puts the boundary 30 yards south of that. He straightened. That's inside my fence line. By their drawing, your fence line is in the wrong place. She looked up at him. That's how it starts. He was quiet for a moment. She could see him thinking, not the slow, heavy thinking of a man caught off guard, but the sharp, focused thinking of someone who had understood a threat and was calculating distance and terrain. Miles City, he said. As soon as the road allows it, she said, and I want to write to someone first. A man named Aldous Webb. He was a senior partner at the firm in Jefferson City. He's retired now, but he knows property law and he knows Meridian's methods. He may know if they've filed anything preliminary. You trust him? She thought about it honestly. He was always fair with me, she said, which wasn't required of him, so yes, I trust him within reason. Write the letter tonight, Gideon said. She already had the writing box open. The letter to Aldous Webb took 3 drafts. Not because she was uncertain what to say, but because she needed to say it precisely. She described the company, the visit, the diagram, the boundary discrepancy. She described Gideon's original land grant in enough detail that Webb could identify any matching filings in the territorial records. She did not ask for his help directly. She described the situation and let the description make the request. That was something she'd learned from watching the best lawyers she'd ever worked alongside. You never ask for what you want when you can make the other person see it as the obvious next step. She sent it with the postwriter the following morning. Then she waited, and while she waited, she worked, because waiting without working was not something she was built for. She pulled every land document from Gideon's tin box and read through all of it. The original grant, the territorial survey from 1871, the deed of transfer when Gideon's father had passed the land to him, 2 boundary agreements with neighboring properties that had been recorded in Harlan's Crossing. She made notes in the margin of her catalog, not with any intention of showing them to anyone but to organize her own thinking. She was looking for the weakness, the point where the documentation was ambiguous enough to exploit, the seam that Meridian's lawyers would push a finger into and pry. She found it on the 3rd day. The 1871 survey used a creek bend as the eastern boundary marker. The creek had shifted since 1871, not dramatically, but measurably. A wet decade in the 1880s had moved the main channel perhaps 15 yards west of where the original survey had placed it. If Meridian had commissioned a survey that measured from the current creek position rather than the historical position, they could argue the original eastern boundary was 15 yards further west than Gideon had been treating it, which would put their proposed right-of-way corridor within the corrected boundaries rather than outside them. It was thin, but thin was enough if the judge didn't know what to look for. She went to find Gideon. He was in the barn working on the fence post puller that had been giving him trouble all winter. She stood in the doorway and told him what she'd found. He listened without interrupting. When she was done, he set down the tool he was holding and said, Is it fixable? Possibly. If there's an older map, something that shows the creek's historical position before the shift, a survey from before 1871, or a trapper's map, or even a military record from the territorial period, anything that documents where the creek ran before. The territorial records would be in Miles City. Some of them, and some might be in the county office in Harlan's Crossing. She paused. Also, Abel Pierce. He raised an eyebrow. He's been here longer than anyone, she said. If anyone remembers how the land lay before the creek shifted, it's him. They rode into Harlan's Crossing 2 days later when the road was firm enough. She went to the county office, which was a single room behind the post office staffed by a thin young man named Hooper, who seemed genuinely startled to have visitors. Gideon went to find Pierce. The county records were incomplete in the way frontier county records always were. Gaps where documents had been lost or never filed properly. Years missing entirely. Some entries written in handwriting so bad she had to hold the page at an angle to make sense of it. But she worked through the property file for the Ashcroft land patiently, page by page, and in the back of a bound volume from 1868, she found something useful. A preliminary boundary notation made by a land agent named Samuel Cook, who had mapped the Northern Valley properties before the formal territorial survey of 1871. Cook's notation described the East Boundary Creek as running some 40 yards east of the stand of 3 cottonwood trees on the Ashcroft property. She sat very still for a moment. She knew those cottonwood trees. She'd seen them from the wagon on one of her early rides around the property with Gideon. They were old enough to have been saplings in 1868 without any question. If Cook's notation placed the creek 40 yards east of the cottonwoods in 1868, and the creek now ran approximately 15 yards west of where the 1871 survey had placed it, then the creek had actually moved more than 50 yards west over the course of 60 years. And the historical eastern boundary of the Ashcroft land was significantly further east than even the 1871 survey reflected. Meridian wasn't just wrong about the boundary. They were wrong in a direction that made the Ashcroft claim stronger, not weaker. She copied Cook's notation word for word in her catalog, noted the page and volume, and went to find Gideon. He was with Pierce in the back of the general store, both of them bent over something on the counter. She came in and they looked up, and Pierce said, "She looks like she found something." "Cook's survey notation," she said to Gideon. 1868. It places the creek boundary 40 yards east of the cottonwoods. He stared at her. "That's past their proposed right-of-way line." "Well past it," she said. Pierce made a sound. "Cook's survey," he said slowly. "I haven't heard that name in 30 years. She turned to him. "Did you know him?" "Knew of him. He mapped most of the valley before the territory was formalized. Reliable man from what people said. Particular about measurements." He paused. "There was a fellow who came through last September asking about old survey records. Didn't say why. I told him the county office was his best stop." He looked at her steadily. "I didn't know what he was after." "What did he look like?" Pierce described a man who was not Christ, younger, thinner, the look of a technical man rather than a business one. A surveyor, most likely. Hired by Meridian months before they'd ever knocked on Gideon's door. She felt the coldness of that settle in. They had been preparing this for a long time. "They asked about old records specifically," she said to Pierce. "Did they find anything?" "Hooper was new last September," Pierce said. Kid wouldn't have known what he was looking at. She thought about Hooper's filing system, or rather the absence of one, and the 1868 volume sitting innocently in the back of a bound set that no one had touched in decades. "They may not have found Cook's notation," she said. "It wasn't well indexed." Gideon had been quiet through this. She looked at him and saw that he was doing the specific stillness he did when something had moved from abstract to concrete in his mind, from a problem you understood to a fight you were actually in. "What do we need?" he said. "A certified copy of Cook's notation from the county record," she said. "A statement from Pierce about what was asked in September, if he's willing." She looked at Pierce. "I'm willing," Pierce said without hesitation. "And a lawyer who knows how to present historical survey evidence," she said. "Someone the judge in Miles City will take seriously." "Webb?" Gideon asked. "Webb is in Missouri," she said. "But his response may name someone he trusts out here." She paused. "We should also go to Miles City before they file anything. If we can establish our position with the county recorder there before Meridian does, it changes the shape of the dispute. He was already picking up his coat. How long to get the certified copy from Hooper? I'll go ask him now, she said. Hooper, to his credit, understood the urgency when she explained it. Or rather, he understood that something significant was happening and was sensible enough to recognize he should be helpful rather than bureaucratic about it. He produced the certified copy that afternoon, stamped and signed, and she held it with the same careful pressure she'd once used on documents that had moved through the firm in Jefferson City, aware of the weight of paper, how much damage it could do or undo depending on whose hands it was in. Webb's reply arrived 9 days later, forwarded through the postwriter with unusual speed that suggested Webb had moved quickly when he'd read her letter. The letter was short and clear in the way experienced lawyers write when the situation is serious. He confirmed that Meridian had filed similar challenges in 3 other territories in the past 4 years, that 2 had succeeded due to lack of opposing documentation, that the 3rd had been defeated by precisely the kind of historical survey evidence she had found. He named a lawyer in Miles City, a man named Garrett Foss, whom he described as thorough and unintimidated by corporate interests. And he said something at the end that she read twice. You always understood these documents better than you were given credit for, Evelyn. Use that. She folded the letter and put it in the wooden box. That evening, Gideon came in from outside with a particular deliberateness in his step, the way he moved when he'd been thinking hard through physical work and had arrived somewhere. He sat down, looked at her across the table, and said, I want to know what we're actually up against. Not the legal version, the real version. She looked at him steadily. The real version is that Meridian has money and lawyers and experience, and they believe no one out here has the resources or the knowledge to push back effectively. She paused. They're not wrong about most of it. But not all of it. No, she said. Not all of it. What's their strongest position? The creek shift. If they argue that the 1871 survey controls, and that the creek now defines the eastern boundary, and they have a modern survey to support it, they have a technical argument. And ours? Cook's notation establishes the historical position predating the 1871 survey, which means the 1871 survey itself may have been imprecise at the time of filing. A judge who understands historical survey precedent would see that their claim rests on a moving reference point. She pulled out her catalog and set it on the table. And I have something else. He leaned forward. The boundary agreement your father made with the Hennessy property in 1879, she said, flipping to the relevant page of her notes. It specifically references the eastern fence line of the Ashcroft property as the agreed boundary between the 2 parcels. The Hennessy line is still there. If your fence line was at a consistent position in 1879 and has not moved, it corroborates the historical boundary claim independent of the survey documentation. He was quiet for a moment. The east fence line hasn't moved since my father built it, he said. I've replaced posts in the same holes. She looked at him. Can you prove that? He thought. Emmett helped me replace posts in 1907, 1912, and 1918. He'd remember the locations. Where's Emmett? Billings. I have his address. Write to him tonight, she said. He pulled the papers toward him without argument. She got the ink. They sat at the same table and wrote their separate letters in the lamplight, his to an old friend asking him to testify to the position of fence posts, hers to Garrett Foss in Miles City, laying out the full case as she understood it. The fire was lower than usual because she'd been too occupied to keep it properly built. The cabin was cold enough that their breath occasionally showed. The documents were spread across the table between them, weighted at the corners with a coffee cup and a spare bootlace and an old river stone that Gideon used as a paperweight. And the whole arrangement looked nothing like the polished legal offices she'd worked in for years, nothing like the mahogany tables and the gas lamps and the shelves of leather-bound precedents. But she had never in any of those polished offices felt this particular quality of focus, this specific gravity, the feeling of a problem that was genuinely yours, that would take exactly what you had and maybe a little more, and that you were going to fight not because you had been told to, but because walking away was not something either of the people at this table knew how to do. She finished her letter to Garrett Foss and read it back once. It was good. It was the clearest and most precise thing she'd written since Jefferson City, and she knew it, and she felt the knowing not as pride but as a kind of relief. The way you feel when a skill you were afraid you'd lost comes back under your hands. Gideon was still writing. His penmanship was not elegant, but it was deliberate and legible, each word placed with the same care he gave to anything he did with his hands. She sealed her letter and set it aside and looked at him across the lamp, and the documents, and the coffee cup, and the river stone. "Gideon," she said. He looked up. "They're going to come back," she said, "before we can get to Miles City and get Foss engaged. Chris is going to come back with something more formal and a shorter timeline, and he's going to try to pressure a decision before we're ready." She held his gaze. "We need to not be pressured." "We won't be," he said. "It'll be harder than it sounds. They're good at this." "I know." He set down his pen. "But I've been working this land for 15 years, Evelyn, every foot of it. That creek, those cottonwoods, that fence line." He picked up the river stone, turned it in his hand once, set it back. "They can bring all the lawyers they want. They weren't here. We were." She held that for a moment. "Yes," she said. "That's exactly right." He picked up his pen and finished the letter. She got up to rebuild the fire. The wind started again somewhere over the ridge, feeling its way along the cabin walls the way it always did, looking for a weakness to push through. It didn't find one. Chris came back on a Thursday, as she had predicted, and this time he brought a second man. The second man was younger, quieter, and carried a leather satchel that was too full to close properly. He had the look of someone who had been trained to sit in the background and hand documents forward at the right moment, which was exactly what he did. He sat in the chair Gideon offered him by the wall and said nothing while Chris talked, and watched Evelyn with the careful attention of someone who had been briefed to watch her specifically. She noted that. She kept her face easy. Chris' tone had changed from the first visit. The collaborative warmth was still there, but underneath it now was something with more weight. The particular pressure of a man who had moved from the offering stage to the closing stage and needed the people across the table to understand that. The company, he said, had completed its survey of the corridor. He produced a document from the satchel. The young man handed it forward on cue and laid it on the table. A formal survey, stamped and notarized, showing the proposed right-of-way with precise measurements and a boundary line that placed the eastern edge of the Ashcroft property exactly where Evelyn had known they would place it, 15 yards west of where Gideon's fence had stood for 30 years. "We've had to make some adjustments to our initial diagram," Chris said, with the careful lightness of a man walking across ice. "The formal survey reflects the current legal boundary with greater accuracy than our preliminary work." Gideon looked at the survey. He looked at it the way he looked at a section of fence that had failed, working out exactly where the break was and why. "You're saying my fence is in the wrong place." The survey indicates a minor discrepancy between the fence's current position and the recorded boundary. "Yes." "My father put that fence in 1879, Gideon said, based on a boundary agreement with the neighboring property that was witnessed and recorded. Chris nodded as if this were a point he had already considered and moved past. Property agreements between private parties don't supersede territorial survey records, unfortunately. The formal survey is the controlling document. He paused. Which is why we believe the company's position here is quite solid. Evelyn had been looking at the survey document since Chris had placed it on the table. She picked it up, which she'd been waiting to do until she'd looked at everything she could see from where she sat. She turned to the second page, where the surveyor's certification and methodology were recorded. She read it carefully while Chris continued talking. The surveyor of record was a man named T.W. Birch, licensed in the territory of Montana. Survey completed October 14th of the previous year. The methodology section described a baseline measurement from a fixed point, described as a iron post marker established by the Meridian Corporation in August of the same year. She set the survey down. "Mr. Christ," she said, "the baseline reference point for this survey is a post marker established by your company in August. That's standard practice for a corporate survey. It means your boundary determination is measured from a point you created, not from any historical or governmental reference." She kept her voice entirely neutral, the way she'd learned to do in rooms full of men who were waiting for a woman to show emotion as a reason to stop listening. A court would want to know why the survey didn't use the existing federal land office markers. The young man with the satchel shifted slightly in his chair. Chris' smile held. "The federal markers in this area are dated and have known precision issues. A modern baseline is more accurate." More accurate for the purpose of moving the boundary line 15 yards west, she said. Yes, I imagine it would be. A silence. Gideon said nothing. He'd understood, within the first 10 minutes of her laying out the legal landscape to him, that his role in meetings like this one was to be present and to not fill silences that she was managing. He was good at it. Better than she'd expected, honestly. He had the quality of a man who knew when to speak and when the speaking would only cost him. Christ set his hands flat on the table. Mrs. Ashcroft, I want to be straightforward with you. Please, she said. The company intends to proceed with this corridor. The route has been approved at the territorial level. We would strongly prefer to reach an agreement with you voluntarily. That's always better for everyone involved. But if an agreement isn't reached, the company will seek a legal determination of the boundary question. And I think you understand that the company has considerable resources for that kind of proceeding. He meant it as a door closing. She heard it as one opening. We understand, she said. We'll need time to review the survey documentation with our lawyer. Something moved in Chris' expression. You've engaged legal representation? Of course, she said, which was technically true. Foss's reply had arrived 6 days ago, confirming he would take the case. Chris recalibrated. She watched him do it, a small reset behind his eyes, a reassessment of what he was dealing with. Naturally, he said. How much time do you need? We'll contact your office by the end of the month, she said. He picked up his hat. The young man retrieved the survey document, except that Evelyn's hand was already resting on it, and she said pleasantly, We'll need a copy of this for our lawyer to review. A beat. Chris nodded at the young man, who produced a second copy from the satchel. She took it and set it on top of her catalog. When they were gone and the sound of horses had faded down the trail, Gideon stood at the window for a moment, then turned. End of the month, he said. That's 12 days. Enough, she said. Foss needs to file a counter-declaration of boundary with the county recorder in Miles City before Meridian files anything formal. If we establish our position in the record first, they have to respond to us instead of the other way around. Can we make it to Miles City and back in 12 days? We have to leave by Saturday, she said. He looked at the survey copy in her hands. You found something in that, he said. It wasn't a question. The iron post, she said. They established their own baseline reference in August, 4 months before the survey was completed. That means they were planning this boundary argument before they ever knocked on our door, before they came to you with the offer. She paused. They didn't find a boundary discrepancy and decide to approach you. They planned the boundary argument and then came to you. The offer was the backup option. He was very still. If we can show that the baseline post was placed with the intent to alter the boundary measurement, not for accuracy but for outcome, then the survey isn't a correction to the historical record. It's a manufactured one. She looked at him. That changes what this is from a property dispute to something considerably worse for them. He said slowly, How do you prove intent? You find Birch, she said. The surveyor. A man hired for a job knows what the job was actually for. Whether he'll say so is a different question, but Foss will know how to approach that. Saturday came fast. They left before dawn, the wagon loaded with documents and a change of clothes and enough food for the road. The Miles City route was 2 days in good weather, and the weather was holding, cold but clear, the road frozen solid, which made it fast if unpleasant. She had never been to Miles City. She'd passed through larger towns in Missouri and seen the particular quality of a frontier town that believed itself larger than it was. The wide main street designed for ambition, the buildings that started in wood and occasionally made it to brick, the mixture of permanent and transient that gave such places their specific restlessness. Garrett Foss had an office on the second floor of a building on the main street above a land title company, which she found darkly appropriate. He was older than she'd expected from Webb's description. Late 60s, lean and deliberate in his movements, with a face that had been weathered into something that looked permanently skeptical. He shook Gideon's hand and then hers with equal firmness and looked at the documents she placed on his desk with the focused attention of a man who genuinely loved a complicated problem. He read everything without speaking. She had organized the documents in the order she wanted him to encounter them. The original grant first, then Cook's notation, then the 1879 boundary agreement, then Meridian survey, then her notes on the iron post baseline. He worked through it all in sequence, and when he finished, he looked up at her and said, Webb said you were good at this. Webb was kind, she said. Webb is not kind, Foss said. Webb is precise. There's a difference. He tapped the survey copy. The baseline post. You want me to find Birch. I want to know if Birch can be found and whether he'd be willing to speak to the methodology. He's local, Foss said. I know who he is. Whether he'd put himself crossways with a railroad corporation is a separate matter. He looked at Gideon. How certain are you about the fence line positions? Certain enough to put my hand on it, Gideon said. And I have a man in Billings who helped me replace posts in 1907, 1912, and 1918. Same holes every time. Written statement from him? Letters already sent, Evelyn said. Foss looked at her again with the expression of a man updating an assessment. All right, he said. The counter declaration needs to be filed today if we're going to get ahead of them. I'll draft it this afternoon. You'll need to sign it before the county recorder here before you go back. We can do that, she said. The Cook notation is your strongest single piece, Foss said. But I want to see the cottonwood trees. She blinked. You want to come to the property? I need to see what I'm arguing. I've had clients describe landmarks to me with complete confidence, and then I go out and the landmark is a stump. He said it without apology. I'll come out next week. Before we're in front of any judge, I want to have stood where Cook stood. That's fine, Gideon said. He said it like he meant it, like having a lawyer who wanted to look at the actual ground was, in his experience, not something to take for granted. They filed the counter-declaration that afternoon. Standing at the county recorder's desk while the clerk stamped and registered the document, Evelyn felt the specific satisfaction of a thing done correctly and in time. The satisfaction that had nothing to do with winning, not yet, but with having moved precisely when precision was required. Foss found Birch. It took him 4 days after their return, and his letter arrived with the next postwriter with the careful understatement of a man who is trying not to say too much in writing. Birch, the letter indicated, had expressed some discomfort with how the survey project had been described to him at the outset. He had been told he was conducting a verification survey of an existing boundary. He had not been told that the baseline post from which he was measuring had been placed by the company itself, or that the measurement outcome had been anticipated before he began. When this had become clear to him, he had completed the work because he had a contract and a family, but he had kept his original field notes. Foss had seen the field notes. The field notes showed that Birch's first 3 baseline measurements, taken from the federal land office marker that the company had told him was imprecise, had placed the eastern boundary significantly further east than the final survey showed. The discrepancy between his preliminary measurements and the final filed survey was not a precision adjustment. It was a deliberate shift of 22 yards. She read the letter twice and then sat down, because her legs had gone slightly unsteady. Not from fear, but from the specific physical response to something clicking into place that you have been working toward for weeks. She read it a 3rd time and then went to find Gideon. He was at the workbench in the barn again, in the same position she'd found him in weeks ago, bent over a piece of wood with the small chisel, working carefully. He looked up when she came in. She handed him the letter without speaking. He read it. His expression didn't change dramatically. There was no dramatic expression kind of man in him, but something shifted in his jaw and his eyes, a specific tightening that she recognized as the thing that happened when he was angry in a way that had nowhere to go yet. He knew, Gideon said. Birch knew by the time he filed it, yes, she said. Whether he understood from the beginning or figured it out during the work, the field notes show the gap. And Kristen, whoever gave him instructions, she said. The question is how far up it goes. Foss thinks there may be a pattern. Other properties, other counties. He's looking. Gideon set down the letter. He picked up the chisel and then set that down too. What happens now? Foss wants to bring this to the district court in Miles City rather than let it sit as a boundary dispute with the county recorder. He thinks the field notes change it from a property argument to something the court needs to address. She paused. He also thinks we should be prepared to appear, both of us. In court? Yes. He was quiet. She watched him look out the barn door toward the east pasture, toward the fence line that had been there since before he'd been old enough to understand what a fence line meant. 30 years of posts in the same holes, his father's decision made permanent by repetition, now the center of a fight with a company that had more lawyers than this county had residents. Evelyn, he said, He was still looking at the pasture. What are the chances? She considered giving him the careful, measured answer, the lawyer's version, all hedges and qualifications. But he was not asking for the careful, measured answer. He was asking her specifically for what she actually believed. Better than they were 3 weeks ago, she said. Birch's field notes are the kind of evidence that's hard to explain away. And Cook's notation gives us a historical position that predates their entire argument. She paused. It's not certain. Nothing like this is certain, but we have a real case. He turned from the pasture and looked at her. The afternoon light came in flat and cold through the barn door and caught the side of his face, the weathered lines of it, the particular steadiness that had been the first thing she'd actually trusted about him. You've been building this since February, he said, since before we even knew what we were dealing with. I recognize the shape of it, she said, from Jefferson City. All those files you read. All those cases I watched from the back of the room, she said, where I wasn't supposed to know what I knew. He held her gaze. You knew, he said. Yes, she said. I knew. He picked up the chisel again, and she realized he was returning to work not because the conversation was finished, but because that was what he did when he was carrying something. He worked. She understood that. She had her own version of it. She turned to go and then stopped, because the thing she'd noticed weeks ago in the barn and deliberately not asked about was there again on the workbench, the small piece of wood he'd been shaping all winter. It was further along now. She could see what it was. A bird. Small, carefully carved, its wings slightly open, its posture suggesting the moment just before flight. The detail in the feathers was more precise than anything she'd have expected from a man who claimed to have no patience for fine work. She looked at it for a moment without speaking. He didn't look up from the chisel, but she saw the tension in his hands change, a slight self-consciousness, the way a person moves when they know they're being watched doing something private. She didn't say anything. She walked back to the cabin and got the fire going and started on dinner and thought about the bird and what it meant that he'd been making it quietly all winter and was not yet ready to show it to her. That evening, Foss arrived. He'd made the trip out to see the property as he'd promised, and the three of them stood in the cold at the east fence line in the last of the afternoon light while Foss looked at the ground and the cottonwood trees and the fence posts and said very little. He walked the line for 20 minutes, measuring distances with a long pace that was practiced enough to be reasonably accurate. He stood at the cottonwoods and looked east toward the creek. 40 yards, he said, finally. He wasn't talking to either of them, exactly. He was confirming something to himself. 40 yards to the current creek channel, she said. Cook's notation says 40 yards east of the cottonwoods in 1868. The creek has moved approximately 55 yards west since then, which means Cook's boundary is further east than the creek's current position, Foss said. He looked at her. And Meridian's survey baseline post is located 12 yards east of the current creek channel, she said, which they presented as the corrected eastern boundary. But if the creek moved 55 yards west from its 1868 position, and their baseline post is only 12 yards east of the current channel, she paused. Their post is 43 yards west of the historical boundary, Foss said. Yes, she said. He looked at the cottonwood trees for another long moment. One of them was very old, gnarled at the base, its bark deeply furrowed, its upper branches bare against the evening sky. A tree that had been standing when Cook walked this ground in 1868 and written his notation and moved on, not knowing that 60 years later someone would need exactly what he'd written. I want to be in front of Judge Calloway, Foss said. He's been on the bench in Miles City for 18 years. He has no patience for manufactured evidence. He turned back toward the cabin. And I think that's what we're going to call this. Manufactured evidence. Not a survey error, not a methodology difference. A deliberate falsification of public land records. Gideon, who had been standing slightly behind them through this exchange, spoke then. Can you prove that to a judge? I can show it, Foss said. Birch's field notes, your original grant documentation, Cook's notation, the fence line evidence. The gap between Birch's preliminary measurements and the filed survey speaks for itself when you lay it out in sequence. He paused. Your wife is going to need to present some of this. Gideon looked at her. She looked at Foss. In court? You understand these documents better than I do in several specific areas, Foss said plainly. And a witness who can explain complex survey evidence to a judge in plain language is worth more than a lawyer reading from notes. He paused. Webb's letter said as much. He said you'd explained cases to senior partners more clearly than the partners could explain them to each other. She felt something strange move through her. Not quite embarrassment, not quite pleasure. The particular discomfort of being accurately seen by someone who didn't need anything from you. I can do that, she said. The night Foss rode back toward Miles City, Gideon and Evelyn sat at the table with the documents spread between them one more time, and she walked him through the sequence of presentation the way she'd been planning it. What came first, what depended on what, where Birch's field notes landed in the argument, and why their position in the sequence mattered. He listened to all of it. When she finished, he sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment. In Jefferson City, he said. In that firm. Did they know what they had? She thought about it honestly. Some of them, she said. The ones worth working for. And the others? The others saw what they expected to see, she said. Which was someone useful but not important. He looked at her steadily. They were wrong, he said. She looked back at him. The fire was low again. She'd been too occupied again to keep it up properly, and the lamp threw a warm, limited circle across the table and the documents and his face. Yes, she said quietly. They were. He reached across the table and straightened one of the document pages that had gone slightly crooked. A small, deliberate gesture, the kind that doesn't mean anything by itself but means something in context. She understood it the way she'd learned to understand most things about him, not through what he said, but through the quality of his attention. They were going to Miles City in 9 days. They were going to stand in a courtroom in front of a judge and present a case against a company that had won this kind of fight 3 times before, in 3 different territories, against people who hadn't had what they had. What they had was not perfect. It had gaps and risks and uncertainties that she was honest enough not to pretend away. But it was real, and it was theirs. And she was finished being the person in the back of the room who understood everything and was permitted to say nothing. They left for Miles City on a Tuesday, before the sun was fully up. Evelyn had been awake since 3. Not from anxiety exactly, or not only from anxiety, but from the specific alertness of someone whose mind had been working through the same sequence of steps for days and had now arrived at the point where thinking was no longer useful and only doing remained. She lay in the dark of her room and went through the documents in her head one more time, in order, the way a musician runs through a piece before a performance, not to learn it, but to settle it, to let it become automatic enough that she could trust herself under pressure. She was dressed and had coffee ready when Gideon came out of his room at 4. He looked at her, looked at the coffee, and said nothing. He sat down and drank it, and she sat across from him, and they went over the sequence of presentation one last time. Not because either of them had forgotten it, but because saying it aloud in the quiet of the cabin made it more real than the version that lived in her head. Cook's notation first, she said. Establish the historical position before we discuss the 1871 survey. Then the 1879 boundary agreement, he said. Then Birch's field notes and the gap between his preliminary measurements and the filed survey. That's the pivot point. Everything before it establishes what should have been true, and Birch establishes what they chose to do instead. He nodded. And if they challenge your standing to present the documents, Foss handles that. I'm a witness, not counsel. He calls me, I speak to what the documents show. It's his job to keep them from shutting me down. She paused. But Foss doesn't think they will. He thinks they'll try to minimize rather than exclude, make the document seem technical, complicated, too uncertain to be definitive. That's where the plain language matters. You're good at plain language, he said. When it counts, she said. They loaded the wagon in the dark and drove out of the yard before 5, the horse's breath clouding in the cold air, the land still and white on either side of the road. She had the document case across her lap. He drove without being asked to, which was both practical and, she recognized it as a form of care, the kind that didn't name itself. The road to Miles City took the full 2 days. They stopped the first night at a way station, a rough place with a single common room and a fireplace that smoked too much, and ate whatever was available and slept on cots on opposite sides of the room with a half-dozen other travelers between them. She slept badly. She was aware, in the fitful intervals between waking, of the document case under her cot, and of Gideon's presence across the room, the specific quality of knowing someone was there in the dark, even when you couldn't see them. The second day, they arrived in Miles City by mid-afternoon and went directly to Foss's office. He had Emmett's written statement. It had arrived from Billings 2 days prior, clear and detailed, describing the fence post replacement work in 1907, 1912, and 1918 with the specific locations described in terms of landmarks that matched the property documentation exactly. Emmett's handwriting was slow and deliberate, the writing of someone who had learned late and took the act seriously, and there was something in that deliberateness that she found more credible than any polished legal declaration. Foss had also spoken to Birch. In person, it turned out, was different from the letter. Birch had come to Foss's office on his own, without being summoned, 2 days after Foss's initial contact. He was a small, careful man with the specific guilt of someone who had done a wrong thing for understandable reasons and had not been able to stop thinking about it. He had brought his original field notes. He was prepared to testify. "Why?" she asked Foss when he told them. "He has a daughter," Foss said simply. "She's studying to be a teacher. He said he didn't want her to find out someday what her father had done." She held that for a moment. The particular human complication of it. A man who had compromised himself for his family and then found that his family was the reason he couldn't stay compromised. There was no clean version of that story. There was just the choice he was making now and the cost it would carry. "He understands what he's walking into," she said. "Yes," Foss said. "I made sure he did." The hearing was set for Thursday morning. They had 1 day. She spent most of Wednesday in Foss's office, going through the presentation sequence with him the way she'd gone through it with Gideon, except that now the focus was on anticipating challenges. What Meridian's lawyers would contest, how they would try to reframe the evidence, where the argument was genuinely weak versus where it only appeared weak and needed to be held steady. Foss was good at this. He pushed back on things she'd thought were solid, and she pushed back on his pushbacks. And by the end of the afternoon, they had something she believed in. Not perfectly, not without gaps, but structurally sound in the way a thing is when it's been honestly stress-tested. Gideon sat through most of this. He contributed when he had something specific, details about the land, the fence, the cattle routes, the practical reality of the eastern pasture that only someone who had worked it for 15 years could speak to. The rest of the time he listened, and she could feel him building his own understanding of it, the way he approached any problem that required both knowledge and judgment. That evening, they ate at a restaurant near the courthouse. A real restaurant, with tablecloths, which felt faintly absurd after months of cabin cooking. She ordered something practical. So did he. They ate mostly in silence, which was comfortable, and then she said, without planning to say it, "I'm not nervous about the legal part." He looked at her. "I know these documents," she said. "I know what they show. I can explain them clearly in front of a judge, and I can hold up under challenge. That part I trust." She turned her fork over in her hand. "I'm nervous about what happens if it doesn't work." "The case?" She stopped. She wasn't sure she'd meant to go this far. "Everything," she said. "You've been here 15 years. Your father built that cabin. If we lose this..." "We're not going to lose it," he said. "Gideon, I know it's not certain," he said, which meant he'd heard the thing she'd actually said. "But I stopped carrying the worst-case version around 6 weeks ago." He set down his fork. "About the time I understood that I wasn't carrying it alone." She looked at him across the white tablecloth, in the warm light of the restaurant, a long way from the dark wagon and the first cold night and the 2 cups of coffee that were the beginning of all of this. "That's a lot of trust to put in someone you've known for 4 months, she said. "I've known you longer than 4 months, he said. "I just haven't known you for years." She didn't answer that because there wasn't anything to say that would be equal to it. They walked back to the hotel in the cold evening air, their breath clouding, the main street of Miles City loud with its particular nighttime noise, and she thought, whatever happens tomorrow, something has already been decided. Not by the judge, not by the documents, by 2 people who kept choosing, day after day, in small ways and large ones, to stay at the table. The courtroom was full. She hadn't expected that. She'd imagined something smaller, a handful of people, a procedural hearing, the formal quiet of legal process. What she found instead was a room with every bench occupied, Settlers and ranchers from 3 counties packed in shoulder to shoulder, because word had traveled in the way that word travels in isolated places where news is scarce and stakes are shared. People had come from distances to see this. She recognized Abel Pierce near the back, his wide face calm and attentive. She saw 2 men she didn't know who had the look of neighboring ranchers, the same weathered practical quality as Gideon, the same watchfulness. Meridian had 4 lawyers at their table. 4. In a territorial courthouse against Foss and 2 witnesses. She looked at the 4 lawyers and felt her jaw tighten and then deliberately release it. 4 lawyers meant they were taking this seriously. 4 lawyers meant Foss had been right to push hard. 4 lawyers was information, not a verdict. Judge Calloway was exactly what Foss had described. A man in his 60s with 18 years on the bench and the expression of someone who had long ago run out of patience for being told what to conclude. He ran a tight courtroom. He cut off Meridian's opening statement twice for repetition and cut off Foss's once for over-formality, which Evelyn took as a good sign. He was applying the same standard to both sides, and he wanted substance. The documents came in as Foss presented them, in the sequence she and Gideon had rehearsed. The original grant, Cook's notation, the boundary agreement. Foss walked through each one with the careful economy of a man who knew when explanation was useful and when it was just noise. The Lid Meridian lawyer, a sharp-faced man named Aldridge, who had clearly tried many cases and was not surprised by the historical documentation, interrupted twice with technical objections that Calloway overruled both times without much deliberation. Then Foss called her. She walked to the front of the courtroom and sat in the witness chair and looked at the judge, and then at the room, and then settled her attention on Foss because he was where the work was. He asked her to explain in plain terms what Cook's 1868 notation established about the historical position of the eastern boundary. She explained it. She used the cottonwood trees because they were real and visible and impossible to argue away. She described where they stood, how old they were, what Cook's 40-yard measurement meant in terms of actual ground. She explained how the creek had moved over 60 years and what that movement meant for a boundary that had been measured from it. She kept her language clear and free of jargon, not because she was simplifying for an ignorant audience, but because the truth of it was clear, and dressing it up would only create places for doubt to hide. Calloway asked 2 questions during her testimony. Sharp, specific questions about the dating methodology for the cottonwood trees and whether Cook's notation had ever been formally entered into the territorial survey record. She answered both directly and honestly, including on the second one. No, Cook's notation had never been formally entered because Cook had died before completing the full survey, and the 1871 official survey had not referenced his preliminary work. She did not try to make that sound better than it was. She said it plainly, and then said what it meant, that the 1871 survey had proceeded without the benefit of Cook's more precise preliminary measurements, not that Cook's measurements were wrong. Calloway wrote something. Aldridge's cross-examination was aggressive and specific, which she had expected. He challenged the precision of Cook's 40-yard notation, suggesting it was an approximation rather than a measurement. She conceded that Cook's preliminary notation lacked the formal precision of a licensed survey, and then said clearly that its value was not precision, but historical position. It established where the creek had been before the movement that Meridian's survey was exploiting, and in that function, an approximation was sufficient to show that the company's baseline post was on the wrong side of the historical boundary by a margin too large to be explained by approximation error. Aldridge pushed. She held. She had been in enough rooms with enough men who believed that persistence and volume were substitutes for argument to know that when you were right, the right thing to do was stay quiet and clear and let the pressure pass through you. She did that. She held the same position with the same words when he came at it from 3 different angles, and the third time Calloway said, without looking up, "She's answered that, Mr. Aldridge. Move on." Birch testified after her. He was visibly afraid. His hands weren't steady, and he spoke too quietly at first, and Calloway had to ask him to raise his voice. But his field notes were on the table in front of him, and he knew what they said, and he told the truth about them in the particular way of a man who had been carrying a thing for months and was finally setting it down, not with relief exactly, but with the exhausted honesty of someone who is done pretending. He described the job as it had been represented to him. He described realizing, during the work, that the baseline post from which he was measuring had been placed to produce a specific outcome rather than to accurately locate a historical boundary. He described the gap between his preliminary measurements and the measurements he was directed to use in the final filed document. He described the field notes and why they showed what they showed, and why the discrepancy between them and the filed survey was 22 yards and not a rounding difference. The courtroom was very quiet during this. Aldridge's cross-examination of Birch was considerably less aggressive than his cross of Evelyn. She noticed that. Foss noticed it too, from the slight change in his posture. You don't soften on a witness unless you've calculated that hard pressure will make things worse, and hard pressure on a man who is clearly telling the truth in front of a packed courtroom tends to make things considerably worse. Gideon testified last about the fence line, about his father building it, about the post replacements, about the cattle routes, and the practical use of the eastern pasture and what it meant to the operation of the ranch. He was not a legal witness by training, and he knew it, and he testified the way he did everything, directly, without decoration, saying what he knew and not saying what he didn't. When Aldridge suggested that the fence line position might have drifted over time through incremental repairs, Gideon said, with a flatness that the courtroom heard, "I replaced posts in the same holes my father dug. I know the difference between a hole in the original position and one that's been moved." Calloway called a recess. She sat beside Gideon on the bench outside the courtroom, and neither of them spoke for a long time. The hallway was cold and smelled like old wood and boot leather. Other people moved through it, talking in low voices. She sat with her hands in her lap and felt, for the first time since February, genuinely tired. Not the functional tired of too much work, but the deep tired that comes when you have been holding something at full tension for a long time and the holding is almost done. He put his hand over hers. Not dramatically. Just placed it there, warm and still, the way he'd placed it on the documents that first night in the cabin when she'd told him what they were dealing with. The same gesture, the same quality of acknowledgement. She turned her hand over and held his. They sat like that until Foss came out and said, "Calloway's ready?" The judge took 11 minutes. 11 minutes to read from his bench what he had found, in the careful sequential language of a man who built his conclusions like walls, one thing on top of another, no gap that couldn't hold weight. He found that the Meridian Corporation's survey of record was inadmissible as evidence of the true boundary position due to the demonstrated discrepancy between the surveyor's preliminary field measurements and the filed document. He found that Cook's 1868 notation, taken together with the 1871 grant documentation and the 1879 boundary agreement, established a historical eastern boundary position that the company's claim did not meet. He found that the placement of the baseline survey post by the corporation prior to commissioning the survey constituted a material misrepresentation of the survey methodology, and he was referring the matter to the territorial prosecutor's office for further review of the filing process. He dismissed every claim against the Ashcroft property. The room made a sound she hadn't expected, not applause exactly, but a collective exhale, the sound of a group of people releasing something they'd been holding. She heard it from the ranchers in the back rows. She heard it from Pierce. She sat very still and felt it move through the room. Aldridge was already leaning toward his colleagues. The four lawyers at the Meridian table put their heads together with the quick, contained movements of people who are recalculating. Foss, beside her, said quietly, "It's done." Outside the courthouse, the afternoon was cold and clear, the kind of March afternoon that was genuinely beginning to feel like something might eventually soften, even if it wasn't soft yet. The light had that late winter quality, low and specific, picking out details sharply, the shadows long and blue on the snow. Pierce found them on the steps. He shook Gideon's hand and then, with a slight pause of consideration, shook Evelyn's and said, "I've been watching this valley for 30 years. That's the first time I've seen anyone put Meridian on the back foot." He paused. "You two know what you did in there is going to travel." "Let it," Gideon said. Pierce nodded once. "Two other ranchers talked to me this morning. Both of them got visits last fall from a man matching Christ's description." He looked at Evelyn. "They'd like to speak with your lawyer." She looked at Foss, who was standing slightly behind them with the expression of a man who has just been handed more work and is not entirely unhappy about it. "Send them to me," he said. The road home took 2 days again, and the weather held, and they talked more than they had on the way out. Not about the case, which was finished, but about other things. about what spring would require on the ranch, about the root cellar and what needed to be restocked, about a letter she'd had from Ruth the previous week, who had heard nothing more from Evelyn's former husband, who had apparently redirected his particular kind of stubborn toward a business dispute in Kansas City that was occupying his attention more usefully. She told Gideon about the letter, about the silence from that direction. "Does that change anything?" he asked. Not pressing, just asking. She thought about what he was actually asking us, not about her former husband, but about the arrangement, the 1-year term, the agency's 30-day notice provision, the formal legality that was still technically the structure beneath everything they had actually become. "No," she said. "It doesn't change anything." He looked at the road. "Good," he said. That was all. It was enough. They came over the last ridge in the late afternoon of the second day, and the ranch came into view below them. The cabin, the barn, the east pasture, with the fence line that had been there since before either of them, the cottonwood trees at the far edge standing bare against the pale sky. The snow was still thick, but the south-facing slope of the roof had a melt line at the edge, where the afternoon sun had been working at it. Small, barely visible, but there. Spring was still 6 weeks away, probably. The mountains didn't do anything on schedule, but it was coming, in the way things come that have been coming for a long time. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but with the slow inevitability of a process that had been running underneath the cold all along. She thought about what it meant to fight for a place. Not defend it from a distance, not protect it abstractly, but actually put your hands into its specific problems and refuse to let go. She had grown up being told that belonging somewhere was about where you were from, the city, the family, the history you could trace. She had spent years in Jefferson City in a building full of other people's histories, useful to them, invisible in her own right, and she had thought for a long time that the invisibility was the price of the usefulness. She understood now that she had simply been in the wrong place, not the wrong profession, not the wrong work, the wrong place. And that the rightness of a place was not something you discovered all at once, but something you built, slowly, through ordinary days and difficult ones, until one afternoon you came over a ridge and looked down at a cabin and a fence line and a set of old trees and felt, without ceremony, that they were yours, that the work of them was yours, that the fighting for them had been yours, and the winning, and whatever came next. Gideon stopped the wagon at the top of the ridge for a moment before starting down, the way he always did, a habit she'd noticed early and never asked about. He looked at the property with the specific attention of a man who has looked at the same view for 15 years and still finds it worth stopping for. She understood that now, too. That evening, after the horses were settled and the fire was up and they had eaten, and she was sitting at the table with a letter to Ruth half written in front of her, Gideon came out of his room carrying something. He set it on the table beside her writing box without speaking. The bird. The carved bluebird she had seen on the workbench in the barn, twice, and deliberately not asked about. It was finished now. She could see the full patience of it up close, the individual feathers shaped with a small tool, the slight tilt of the head, the wings held at that precise angle of something about to lift off but not yet gone. The wood had been smoothed and lightly oiled, and it had the warm color of something that had been handled carefully. She looked at it for a long time. "I started it in November," he said. He was standing with his hands in his pockets, which was what he did when he was uncertain about something. "I didn't know what I was making at first." "When did you know?" she asked. "December," he said, "around Christmas." She picked it up carefully. It fit exactly in her palm. She looked at the detail of it and thought about him in the barn in the cold evenings with the small chisel, working at something he hadn't yet named, building it anyway. That was who he was, she thought. That was the whole of him, really. A man who built things carefully, in the dark, without knowing yet what they were for, trusting that the work itself would tell him. "It's a bluebird," she said. "Claire used to say they meant something was changing," he said. "Not good or bad, just changing." She held the bird and looked at him. He was watching her face with the particular attention that had replaced, over these months, the careful distance of the beginning. The attention of someone who was no longer bracing against knowing you but had decided at some point without announcement to actually see you. "Thank you," she said. He sat down across from her. "You're welcome," he said. She set the bird on the table between them, wings open, facing toward the window and the dark beyond it, and the mountains beyond that, where the snow was already, imperceptibly, beginning its long surrender to the coming warmth. She picked up her pen and finished the letter to Ruth. He pulled the almanac from the shelf and read it by the fire, or pretended to, and she could feel him not reading it the same way she could feel the bird sitting on the table between them. A presence, a thing that had been made over time from patience and intention that was simply, now, there. Outside, the Montana night did what it always did. It went very cold and very dark and very quiet, with the mountains holding the sky up the way they had for 1,000 years and would for 1,000 more, indifferent to the particular lives being lived at their feet. But inside the cabin, the fire was good, and the lamp was warm, and two people who had arrived in each other's lives as strangers and become, through necessity and difficulty and the slow accumulation of ordinary days, something that neither of them had a clean word for, but that both of them recognized without needing to name it as the thing they had been moving toward all along. Not a perfect thing, not an easy thing, a real thing built by hand in winter from whatever was available, the most durable kind.